The light on the horizon that night was not a falling star. It was a torch, and behind it, 3 days' ride away, Lord Vert was coming with 12 men, sealed orders, and a simple conviction that people with no name on a map had nothing worth defending. He had never been more wrong in his life. Kyle did not sleep. He had learned during the war that certain kinds of quiet were not quiet at all. They were the held breath before something moved. The valley had been making that sound since sundown, and by the second hour of full dark, he stopped pretending the feeling would pass. He left the camp without waking the others. Thorga was a light sleeper and would hear him go, but she would also understand. There were things a man had to confirm with his own eyes before he had the right to say them out loud. He moved along the eastern ridge with the rifle across his back, keeping low against the skyline. The frost had come early this year, coating the rocks in a thin shell that caught the moonlight and threw it back in pale blue pieces. He moved through it carefully, placing each boot before committing his weight, the way his father had taught him to cross ice on the mountain lakes of his childhood. He smelled the smoke before he saw the fire. A single torch, planted in the ground at the edge of the tree line where the valley opened onto the northern plain. A man crouched beside it, studying the valley below with the patience of someone being paid by the day. His horse was tied 20 yards back, loaded with the kind of gear that meant he was not alone and had not been for some time. Kyle counted what he could see from the ridge. 3 sets of tracks in the frost leading away north. The explorer had already sent 2 riders back with his report. Whatever he had seen in this valley, Vert already knew it. He lay on the cold rock for a long time and watched the man watch his home. Then he counted the supply loads on the horse, calculated the weight, thought about road time, head count, the kind of resources a lord spent when he was not sending a warning but sending a conclusion. 12 men, maybe more, 3 days out, moving at the pace of armed men who were not afraid of what they were riding toward. He came back down the ridge, slowly, the weight of what he had seen settling into his chest with the particular heaviness of something that could not be put back down. The camp was still dark and quiet below. The roan mare shifted when she heard him coming, recognizing his step. He put a hand on her neck without stopping. He stood at the edge of the camp for a moment and looked at the shapes of Thorga and Velka sleeping near the banked fire. He had opened a door once and stepped aside. That single choice had brought him here, to this valley, to this fire, to these 2 people who had become the only thing in his life he would not negotiate away. He crouched beside the fire and fed it 1 piece of dry wood, bringing it back from coals to flame. Then he sat and waited for Thorga to wake, because she always did, and because what he had to say needed to be said face to face in the light. She was awake before he said her name. He had expected that. What he had not expected was the way she sat up and looked at him directly, without the slow gathering of a person pulled from deep sleep. She had been lying still with her eyes closed, but she had not been sleeping. She had heard him leave. She had been waiting for him to come back. He told her everything without softening it, the torch, the explorer, the supply loads, his calculation of the head count, the 3 days they had left. She listened without moving. Her eyes stayed on his face the whole time, not with fear, but with the focused attention of someone building a structure in their mind as fast as the information arrived. When he finished, the silence lasted exactly 1 breath. Then she stood up. She moved to the edge of the camp and looked north toward the ridge he had just come down from, toward the darkness beyond it where 12 men were riding through the frost with sealed orders, and the certainty that no one in this valley would be ready for them. Her jaw was set, her shoulders were straight, and Kyle saw something in the line of her back that he had not fully understood until this moment. This was not the posture of someone bracing for what was coming. It was the posture of someone who had already decided what they were going to do about it. She turned back to him. She said something in the Kelvara tongue, low and even, the way you say something you have been holding for a long time and are finally ready to put down. He did not know the words, But the tone was not despair, and it was not resignation. It was the sound of a woman who had survived this once, and was not willing to lose this time. "You know these men," he said. It was not a question. She met his eyes. She gave a single slow dip of her chin. "Then tell me," he said. She sat back down across from him. For the next hour, with the fire between them and Velka sleeping 3 feet away, Thorga talked, in pieces, in the mix of his language and hers that they had built together over the weeks, part words, part gesture, part the kind of understanding that does not need translation. She told him about the valley behind the Stoneback Range, about the morning the riders came, about the way they moved, the order they used, the mistakes the clan had made in those first minutes that cost everything. She did not tell it like a wound. She told it like a map, every detail precise, every sequence memorized. She had been studying these men since before she arrived at his fence line. She had been planning since before she trusted him enough to say so. Kyle listened to all of it. When she was done, he looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me where you want them." They worked through what remained of the night by firelight, crouched over the map Thorga had carried folded against her body since before the valley, the one she had finally opened on that planning night weeks ago. Now it was spread between them with rocks holding the corners, and she was marking it with a piece of charcoal, drawing the positions with the same precision she had used to describe the attack on the Kelvara. She knew how Vert's men worked because she had watched them work. They moved in a wedge formation on open ground, spreading to a line when they entered enclosed terrain. They targeted high ground first to eliminate any advantage the defenders had in range. They were disciplined, and they were experienced, and they had numbers. But they had never faced a defender who had studied them the way Thorga had. She drew 3 choke points in the valley entrance where the terrain narrowed naturally. She marked 2 high positions on the eastern ridge, where a single rifle could hold a larger group at a distance. She showed Kyle the creek bed that ran below the northern slope, invisible from above, but wide enough to move through quickly. He added what he knew, the dry brush along the western face that would carry sound in the wrong direction, the loose shale on the upper ridge that would betray anyone trying to flank from above. The single blind corner near the old Kelvara fire circle, where a person could move unseen between 2 positions. They built the plan the way they had built the new room in the chalet, each one adding to what the other had started, filling gaps without being asked, until what sat between them on the map was something neither could have made alone. When the first pale light came into the sky, Velka was awake. She had been awake for a while, lying still with the coat pulled up, listening. When she sat up and looked at the map, she did not ask what it was for. She looked at it for a long moment, with the same careful eyes she had used to memorize the rifle components in the chalet, understanding the structure of it without needing it explained. Then she pointed to the blind corner near the fire circle and looked at Thorga. Thorga looked at her for a moment. Velka was small for her age, but the months of running and surviving and rebuilding had made her into something that did not match her years. She read terrain the way animals do, by instinct sharpened into something close to knowledge. She moved without sound when she needed to. She held still longer than most adults could. These were not things she had been taught. They were things she had learned the hard way in the dark, when being wrong meant not surviving. Thorga gave a slow, certain dip of her head. Velka pulled the map toward her and studied her position carefully. He did not say any of it out loud. He picked up the charcoal and added one more detail to the map. They had 2 days, maybe less. They got to work. The next 2 days had no nights in them, not really. They stopped only when the body demanded it, a few hours each, taking turns so someone was always awake and watching the northern ridge. The valley was transformed slowly and deliberately, the way Thorga had described the Kelvara clan transforming their settlements before the winter hunts, every element placed for a reason, nothing wasted. Kyle set the positions on the eastern ridge, carrying stones and timber up the slope on his back to build low blinds that broke his silhouette against the sky. From the upper blind, he could see the entire valley entrance and 300 yards of the northern plain beyond it. From the lower one, he could cover the choke point Thorga had marked at the creek crossing. Thorga worked the valley floor, moving with a knowledge of terrain that came from a lifetime of reading land the way other people read text. She knew where the ground was soft enough to slow a horse. She knew where the shadows fell at midday and at dusk. She arranged things that looked like nothing in particular, but were not nothing in particular, and she did it all without making the valley look prepared, because a valley that looked prepared told the enemy everything. Velka worked without being directed. She moved between them, carrying, hauling, holding things in place, and twice she spotted something neither of them had noticed and corrected it before being asked. On the afternoon of the second day, she took the knife from her belt, the one Cale had given her on that first night in the chalet, and used it to cut a series of markers into the bark of the trees along the creek bed, symbols only the three of them would recognize, a private map inside the larger one. Late on the second afternoon, Kyle was coming down from the upper ridge when he saw her sitting on a rock near the old fire circle, looking at the knife in her hands. He sat down beside her without asking why. She turned the knife once, looking at the handle, then looked up at him. He did not say anything. She reached out and took his hand, not the way a child takes a hand for comfort, but the way a person holds something they are not ready to let go of. Her grip was steady, and her eyes were dry. He did not let go. They sat like that for a while the light went low and gold over the valley walls, and the wind moved through the old stones of the fire circle with a sound like breath. Then she stood up, put the knife back in her belt, and went back to work. Kyle stayed on the rock for another moment. He looked at the bracelet on his wrist. He thought about a fence post and a tin cup of broth and a door left open. Then he stood up and went back to work too. Marsh arrived on the morning of the third day, pushing his horse harder than the old man had any business pushing a horse, coming down the northern trail with his coat open and his face carrying the particular expression of someone delivering news they wish they did not have. Kyle met him at the valley entrance. He was not entirely surprised to see him. When he had bought the roan mare from Marsh weeks ago and said nothing about where they were going, Marsh had asked nothing in return. But the old man had been reading this frontier for decades, and traders who survived that long did so by knowing which trails led where and which people traveled them. Kyle had left enough of a track for a man who knew how to look. Marsh did not bother dismounting. He pulled a folded document from his coat and held it out. "Filed 3 days ago in Haldvast," he said. "Vert's people contested your residency claim, argued the document was issued irregularly, said the registration process wasn't followed proper." He paused. "A circuit judge is riding out to rule on it. Week away, maybe less." Kyle took the document and read it slowly. It was precise and thorough, and written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The argument was not about the land. It was about the process. A technicality buried in the language of frontier property law that, if ruled in Vert's favor, would strip the legal foundation from everything Kyle had filed. Without the document, any resistance the three of them mounted could be framed as unlawful. Vert's men would not be aggressors. They would be officers of legal removal. He folded the document and put it in his coat. Marsh looked at him. "There's more," the old man said, quieter now. "Vert's men were seen on the North Road yesterday morning. They're moving faster than expected. Could be here by tomorrow night." The 2 pieces of information sat in Cale's chest like stones. He walked back into the valley without answering. He found Thorga at the creek bed and told her both things, the contested document and the accelerated timeline. The same way he had told her about the torch on the ridge, without softening, without editorializing. She processed it in silence. Then she said, "Go." He looked at her. "Go find the judge," she said, with the careful words they had built between them over weeks. "We hold the valley. You bring the law." He understood what she was saying. He also understood what she was not saying, what it would cost her to hold this valley with only Velka beside her against 12 armed men, and what it would cost her to ask him to leave. He stood in front of her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching, and in her eyes he saw the same thing he had seen on that second morning when she stood at the edge of camp and looked north. Not fear. Decision. He went to pack the horse. The leaving was the hardest thing. He had made hard choices on this frontier before. He had stayed when leaving would have been easier. He had opened a door when keeping it shut would have been safer. But riding out of that valley in the grey pre-dawn light, with Thorga and Velka standing at the entrance, watching him go, was a different kind of hard. It was the kind that lived in the body, not the mind. He did not look back after the first rise. He had learned that looking back made the distance longer. He rode through the day without stopping except to water the horse at a creek crossing. The northern plain was wide and cold and indifferent, and he moved across it with the focused urgency of a man who understood that the speed of this ride was directly connected to what happened in the valley he had left behind. At nightfall, he made a fireless camp in the lee of a rock formation and slept 3 hours with the rifle across his chest. By the second afternoon, he reached the outer edge of the Haldvas district and began asking questions at every post and way station he passed. A circuit judge travelling this road would leave traces. Judges travelled with at least one clerk, sometimes two, and clerks left traces everywhere they stopped because they needed ink and paper and a flat surface to work on. He found the trail at a way station 12 miles from Haldvast. The judge had passed through that morning, heading east toward a property dispute in the outer settlements. Kyle bought a fresh canteen, changed direction, and pushed the horse harder. He caught up with the judge's party at dusk on the second day, camped beside a dry creek bed with a small fire and a canvas shelter. The judge was a compact, weathered woman named Sable, who had been riding this circuit for 11 years and had the look of someone who had heard every argument at least twice and was not impressed by volume. Kyle laid out the situation plainly, the original document, the contestation, Vert's men already moving on the valley. He did not embellish, he did not appeal to sympathy. He put the facts in sequence and let them sit. Sable read the documents he carried by firelight. She asked 3 questions, sharp and specific. He answered each one directly. She was quiet for longer than he expected. She looked at the fire and then at the documents again, and he could see the weight of it moving through her. The calculation of what riding into an active confrontation meant for a circuit judge operating alone at the edge of her jurisdiction. It was not a small thing he was asking. It was the kind of thing that could go wrong in ways that did not get corrected. Then she stood up and told her clerk to break camp. They rode through the night. Thorga heard them before she saw them. The valley had been quiet for most of the day, the particular quiet she had learned to distrust, and by late afternoon, every instinct she had sharpened over years of survival was telling her the same thing. She sent Velka to the blind corner near the fire circle without speaking, just a look and a gesture, and Velka went without hesitation. Then Thorga went to her position on the lower eastern ridge and waited. They came at dusk, which was when Thorga had expected them. Vert's men knew their work. They used the low light and moved in the wedge formation she had described to Kale, exactly as she had predicted, spreading to a line as they entered the narrow valley entrance. At the front of the formation, she recognized the leader, the same man who had come to the chalet weeks ago, on a grey horse with a polished rifle. Vert had sent his most experienced man, which meant he had also sent someone who had already seen Kale's face, and knew enough about the 3 of them to have tracked their route north through Marsh's trading post, where the purchase of a second horse had pointed him in the right direction. 12 men. She counted them twice. The first thing she did was nothing. She let them come deeper into the valley, past the first choke point, past the soft ground along the creek, past the point where retreat became complicated. She let the terrain do what she had designed it to do, slow them, funnel them, take away the width they needed to use their numbers as an advantage. Then she fired once, high and wide, not to hit anyone, but to stop them. They stopped. The echo of the shot rolled around the valley walls and came back changed, multiplied by the rock faces in a way that made it impossible to tell where it had come from or how many rifles were involved. She had tested this on the second day of preparation. She had counted the echoes herself. A voice called out from below, demanding she show herself. She did not. Instead, Velka moved. From the blind corner, low and fast through the shadow of the old fire circle, she relocated to the second position on the upper ridge, the one Kyle had built, and that only the three of them knew existed. Her movement made a sound, small and deliberate, exactly enough sound to be noticed, exactly enough to suggest that the valley was not held by one person, but by several moving in coordination. The men below hesitated. She could see it from the ridge, the slight backward shift in the formation, the heads turning to consult each other. Thorga fired again, still high, still wide, but from a different position now, having moved in the silence after Velka's distraction. The formation did not advance, but it did not retreat either. They were patient men. They would wait for daylight if they had to. And in daylight, the advantages she had built in the dark would be smaller. She settled into her position, controlled her breathing, and held the line. Below her, the valley was dark and full of men with orders she was not going to let them carry out. She had survived worse. She intended to survive this too. Kyle heard the shots while they were still 2 miles out. 2 reports, spaced apart, each one rolling across the plain and reaching him flattened by distance but unmistakable. He knew the sound of that rifle. He had cleaned it himself 100 times in the chalet while Velka watched from across the room. He looked at Judge Sable beside him. She had already pressed her heels to her horse. They came down the northern trail at a hard gallop, the judge and her clerk and Kyle, and he pushed the horse past its comfortable limit, because 2 shots meant the men were already in the valley and already stopped, and that the only thing between 12 armed men and 2 people he loved was the preparation they had made together and the time he could close in the next 2 miles. He came over the last rise and saw the valley entrance below him and the formation of Vert's men standing inside it. Torches lit now against the full dark, their attention fixed on the ridge ahead of them where Thorga had last fired from. He pulled up hard at the crest. Judge Sable came alongside him. She looked at the scene below for exactly 3 seconds. Then she drew out the document case from her saddlebag, took from it a sealed document with a ribbon and a wax stamp that caught the torchlight from 50 yards away, and rode down the slope at a pace that was neither hurried nor timid. Kyle rode beside her with the rifle across his saddle. The formation heard them coming and turned. The leader raised a hand to halt his men and looked at the approaching riders with the calculating expression of someone trying to decide very quickly what this meant. Sable stopped 10 yards from him and held the document up where the torchlight reached it. "Circuit Judge Sable, Oldvast District," she said. Her voice carried across the valley without effort. "The residency claim filed under Kael'veld's title has been reviewed and validated under Frontier Property Statute. The contestation filed by Lord Vert's office is dismissed for procedural deficiency." She lowered the document but did not put it away. "These people are on legal ground. You are not." The leader looked at the document. He looked at Kyle. He looked back at the ridge where Thorga had fired from. The calculation behind his eyes ran its course. He turned his horse. The formation turned with him, slowly, the way a tide pulls back, not broken, but spent, and moved north, out of the valley entrance, and did not stop. Kyle watched them go until the last torch disappeared over the plain. Then he looked up at the ridge. A shape moved against the dark skyline, descending the slope with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who had been holding still for a very long time and was only now allowing themselves to move freely. Then a smaller shape appeared beside her, and the two of them came down together. He dismounted and walked to meet them. They found the stone the next morning. It was already there, half buried at the center of the old Kelvara fire circle. A flat piece of dark granite, the size of a bread loaf, with one smooth face that had been shaped by water over a long time. Velka found it while the others were making the first fire of the day, and she carried it back to the fire circle and set it upright in the ground without explaining what she was doing. Kyle and Thorga watched her from a distance. She took the knife from her belt, the same knife he had placed on the floor of the chalet that first night, chosen for its size, set down beside the bread and the instructions she could not yet understand in words. She had carried it every day since. It had marks on the handle from her grip. She worked slowly and carefully, cutting into the smooth face of the stone with the concentration she brought to everything she decided mattered. The sound of iron on granite carried across the quiet valley in the cold morning air. When she finished, she stepped back. Kyle came forward and crouched to read it. She had carved 3 marks. Not words in his language, not words in hers. 3 marks from the Kelvara boundary system, the same kind she had drawn in ash on the floor of his chalet all those months ago to show him where she came from. He did not know their precise meaning, but he had learned enough to understand the shape of them, a claim, a name, a permanence. He stayed crouched in front of the stone for a moment. Then he stood. He looked at Thorga. She was looking at the stone with her jaw set and her eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold wind coming over the ridge. He put his hand on her shoulder without thinking, without calculating, the way people do things when they have stopped being careful around each other. She did not look at him, but she raised her hand and covered his, pressing it down, holding it there against her shoulder with a steadiness that said everything she had not yet found the words for. Then Velka's arms came around them both. She pressed her face into the space between them and held on with everything she had, and neither of them moved. And the wind went over them, and the valley was quiet around them in the way that good things are quiet, not empty, not waiting, just still. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally separated, no one said anything. Velka crouched and straightened the stone in the ground, making sure it was set deep enough to hold through winter. Thorga went back to the fire. Kyle stood at the edge of the fire circle and looked out across the valley, at the creek running clear through the bottom, at the old posts still standing from the Kelvara camp, at the 2 horses grazing in the thin morning sun. Lord Vert would not be back. A circuit judge's ruling in the field was not a thing that could be quietly undone. The documents were validated, the contestation was dismissed, and the cost of mounting another operation on a legally recognized territory was a cost that even a lord calculated before spending. It was over. Not the way wars end, with noise and ceremony and a moment everyone agrees to remember. It ended the way most real things end, quietly, on an ordinary morning, with a stone in the ground and a fire starting and 3 people going about the small work of a day in a place that was theirs. Kale looked at the bracelet on his wrist. The carved beads had worn smooth at the edges from months of daily wear. The cord was still strong. He thought about a fence post and a tin cup. He thought about a door he had left open without knowing what would walk through it. He thought, this is what that door was for. Then he turned from the valley view and went to help with the fire.